Okay, so you wanted a deep dive into a legal case, huh? One that makes you question, like, everything you thought you knew about crime and punishment.
And even what it means to be a parent.
Exactly. Buckle up, because we're going deep into the story of Mary Kay LeTourneau.
You're in for a wild ride.
Yeah, this case is full of twists and turns you might not remember from all the headlines back in the late 90s.
We're going way beyond the teacher-student scandal and diving headfirst into the actual court documents.
Yeah, from the Washington State Court of Appeals.
This is where things get really interesting.
It makes you think.
Yeah, it forces you to think about how legal principles and, like, societal values sometimes clash.
Okay, so let's set the stage. You probably remember the basics.
1997, Mary Kay LeTourneau, a schoolteacher,
Right.
pleads guilty to 2 counts of second-degree rape of a child, her 13-year-old student.
Yeah, you might be thinking, okay, well, open and shut case, right?
Yeah.
But that's where the first twist comes in later. LeTourneau's initial sentence was 89 months. Most of it was suspended.
As part of a special program,
Right. It was called a Special Sexual Offender Sentencing Alternative.
or SOSA.
So this SOSA program is key to understanding all the legal complexities we're about to untangle.
It wasn't about just throwing away the key.
Right.
It was about rehabilitation.
Addressing the root causes.
Exactly. Trying to prevent something like this from happening again.
Pretty progressive for the time,
Absolutely.
but it came with strict conditions.
One of the biggest
Yeah.
was a no-contact order. Not just with the victim, but with any minors without supervision.
And this detail, this is key to understanding what happens next.
This is where things get crazy.
Yeah. Less than 2 weeks after being released into this program, LeTourneau is found with the victim.
The result, SOSA revoked full 89 months in prison.
Whoa, talk about high stakes.
And at this point, she's already pregnant with the victim's child.
Giving birth while the legal process is still going on.
She even has a second child with him while she's in prison.
So we've got a complicated legal situation mixed with some serious personal drama, and it doesn't stop there. The court issued 2 additional orders,
And that's what LeTourneau ends up appealing.
not the prison time itself.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I'm sure you're wondering why she'd focus on those orders instead of trying to reduce her sentence.
Well, it was actually a pretty smart legal strategy.
Yeah, her team targeted these specific orders to challenge the restrictions on her freedom of speech,
And believe it or not, her parental rights.
even as a convicted felon. So let's look at these orders one by one, starting with what's been called the no-profit order.
The court basically said, you can't make any money from telling your story.
No book deals, no movie rights.
That's it.
You might be thinking, well, that makes sense. Prevent her from profiting from her crimes,
It seems pretty straightforward.
but it gets more complicated. This order actually conflicted with Washington State's Son of Sam law.
Which is designed to do the opposite.
Wait, what? A law named after a serial killer is designed to help victims.
It's an interesting name, but the Son of Sam law is meant to take any profits criminals make from their crimes and give that money to their victims.
So in LeTourneau's case, if she couldn't profit from her story, it would actually mean less money for other victims.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange twist.
So the law intended to help victims would have backfired.
Exactly.
That's why.
The court saw that contradiction and ended up striking down that no-profit order.
It's a good example of how seemingly simple legal restrictions can have unintended consequences.
For sure.
This brings us to the second order, which restricted LeTourneau's contact with her own children.
This is where things get really ethically tricky.
It's not just about the victim anymore. How do you balance the rights of a convicted sex offender with their parental rights?
Tough question.
It was a challenge for the
Yeah,
court.
They had to decide, was unsupervised contact with her children likely to cause them direct harm?
To figure that out, the court relied on multiple psychological evaluations.
And this might surprise you,
Okay.
but none of them actually diagnosed LeTourneau as a pedophile.
Really, given everything that happened, that's hard to believe.
It is surprising. But remember, the court was looking for specific evidence of a risk of harm to her children, not trying to label her.
Okay.
The evaluations focused more on her behavior patterns,
Okay.
her lack of insight into the severity of her actions,
Uh-huh.
and the possibility that she might try to manipulate her children's understanding of what happened.
So did the court ultimately allow her unsupervised contact with her kids? So did the court ultimately allow her unsupervised contact with her kids?
Well, that's a great question. And it brings up something that might surprise you. The court's concern wasn't just about physical harm.
Oh, okay.
They were also really worried about the potential for psychological harm.
That makes sense. I mean, you're not just worried about, like, their immediate safety.
Right. It's the long-term impact on those kids.
Exactly.
Imagine being a child and seeing your mother, who you're supposed to trust and look up to, go through something like this.
Right.
The court had to consider that LeTourneau might try to, justify her actions to her children.
Yeah.
Or manipulate them into seeing the relationship in a totally different light.
That's a lot for a child to process.
Yeah, trying to make sense of something that even adults struggle to understand.
And LeTourneau wasn't exactly avoiding the public eye either, right?
Oh, she was actually seeking media attention.
Oh, wow.
Even showcased one of her children on television.
Really?
The court saw this as exploitative.
Yeah.
And potentially damaging to the children's well-being.
So it was a combination of her past actions and her current behavior
Exactly.
that raised all these red flags.
But remember, the legal bar for restricting parental rights is super high.
Right.
The state had to prove that unsupervised contact would be a direct and imminent threat to those children.
And could they?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the end, no, they couldn't meet that standard.
So
So the restriction on LeTourneau seeing her own children unsupervised was actually struck down.
wow. So even after everything she did, the court couldn't completely take away her parental rights.
It really shows how important this principle is in our legal system. Even convicted criminals still have certain rights that can't be taken away.
That's interesting.
And the state just couldn't prove that taking away those rights was absolutely necessary to protect the children from immediate harm.
I can imagine that's a hard thing for some people to accept.
Yeah, it forces us to confront this idea
Uh-huh.
that someone who did something so terrible can still have some fundamental rights as a parent.
It really challenges our assumptions about justice and punishment.
Absolutely.
We like to think in terms of black and white, but this case shows us all those shades of gray.
It really does.
And it makes us ask ourselves some tough questions. Where do we draw the line? How do we balance individual rights with protecting children and society as a whole?
It's a debate that goes beyond LeTourneau.
Yeah.
It touches on so many parts of our legal system.
Questions about rehabilitation, the purpose of punishment.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what does it even mean to be a parent?
It's a big question.
What about the victim in all of this?
Oh, that's such an important point.
He was so young when this all started.
Regardless of what happened later, that initial relationship was totally an abuse of power.
Yeah, a 13-year-old cannot legally consent to a relationship with an adult.
Especially someone in a position of authority like a teacher.
Or what about the long-term impact on him? How do you even begin to measure something like that?
It's hard to say for sure, but you can imagine the confusion,
Right.
the struggle to understand what happened.
And don't forget all the media attention.
Oh yeah, he was thrust into the public eye at such a young age.
It's a reminder that these cases aren't just abstract legal battles. They involve real people
Absolutely.
whose lives are deeply affected by these decisions made in courtrooms.
And speaking of real people, what about LeTourneau's other children?
The ones who weren't directly involved but whose lives were turned upside down.
It's heartbreaking to think about trying to make sense of everything that's happening. Their mother's actions, the media, the judgments from others. It must have been incredibly difficult for them.
And the court documents don't capture any of that.
No, they just focus on the legal side of things.
Mm.
They don't show the human costs.
It makes you think about their right to privacy, too. Where do we draw the line between public interest and protecting those kids?
It's a tough question without an easy answer.
That's what makes the LeTourneau case so compelling.
It's more than just legal principles and precedents.
Yeah.
It's about human behavior.
It makes you think about our values, about forgiveness, about redemption.
It's a complex story.
So we've been talking about the legal battles, the appeals, but at the heart of this case is a human story.
With lots of tragedy.
Difficult choices and consequences that went far beyond the people directly involved.
Definitely.
You know, this whole deep dive is making me think about the role of public opinion in cases like this.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, the LeTourneau case was everywhere back then.
It was huge.
Do you think all that pressure influenced the legal process?
That's a really good point, and that's what we'll explore next. How the media shaped the narrative and whether that actually impacted the court's decisions. So yeah, public opinion in these huge cases, it's a fascinating question.
Right. It's hard to imagine that it doesn't have some influence.
I mean, think about it. The LeTourneau case wasn't just happening in some courtroom.
Yeah, it was like,
It was a national event.
it was everywhere.
Headlines, talk show.
Everyone had an opinion.
Right. And that brings us to a question that's relevant to a lot of these really high-profile cases.
Okay.
How do you balance the need for a fair legal process with the fact that public opinion is so powerful.
It's tough, right? Because the law is supposed to be all about facts and precedents.
Exactly.
But public opinion can feel like this.
Like a tidal wave of emotion.
And it's hard to ignore.
Especially in a case like this.
With such a shocking crime.
Right. People are going to be outraged.
They want to see justice.
But does that actually, change what the court decides?
Well, in theory, the court's supposed to be objective.
Right.
Looking at the
You
evidence.
have expert testimony.
All the legal stuff, not just what the public thinks.
But judges and juries, they're people too.
Yeah, of course. They're part of society.
It's impossible to be totally isolated from everything that's being said.
All the opinions and the passion.
Exactly. And that's one reason why choosing the jury is so important.
Right.
You need people who can be fair,
impartial,
put aside their personal feelings.
Focus on the case.
Yeah, just the facts.
It's easy to see how, with LeTourneau, people might have wanted harsher punishments.
Of course people were angry.
They wanted to see consequences.
It's understandable. There's this instinct to protect children.
Right.
To punish anyone who would harm them.
And when it's such an emotional case.
It's easy for that desire for justice to overshadow all the nuances.
Yeah. And if you just read the headlines, you'd miss so much.
All the legal details.
The arguments about her being a parent.
The psychological reports.
Right. It was often simplified.
Sensationalized.
Yeah, the media has so much power in these cases.
They shape how we see things.
And they like to focus on the drama.
Not the whole story.
And it's not just simplifying the legal stuff, it's how they portray the people, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about how LeTourneau is shown.
The victim, their families.
It was all about ratings.
Not understanding what really happened.
It's important to remember that behind all of that,
the headlines, the legal arguments,
there were real people.
With lives and families and feelings.
And those lives are changed by how these stories are told.
Absolutely.
So the LeTourneau case, it's not just a legal puzzle.
It's a warning.
About public opinion, about the media.
And about remembering the people at the heart of it all.
It reminds us that even though the legal system is supposed to be fair,
right,
it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
It's part of society.
Where emotions run high, where people debate and argue.
And where finding justice can be really hard.
It makes us think critically about what we read and hear.
Look past the headlines.
And face those tough ethical questions. This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that.
I thought I knew this case.
It's amazing how much one case can teach us.
About our laws, about our values, about forgiveness, and how complicated people are.
The LeTourneau case. It's still being talked about all these years later.
So what stood out to you? What new questions do you have?
This deep dive, it's just the beginning.
Yeah, it's a foundation.
Keep exploring those issues that resonated with you.
Keep thinking. Keep learning.
That's what this is all about.